Tonight's discussion is U.S. shipbuilding, but that's our exhibit, which you'll see out here. Leanne will explain a little bit more about that exhibit, and then Gene DiOrio will transition us into the building of the QE2 in Scotland. So, some upcoming events. We still have a few seats left for the spring trip, the bus trip to the Independent Seaport Museum, and I'd like to explain the process that we've taken here in recent years to come up with these rotating exhibits that we have. No surprise to you that Scott Houston, our driving force, is the creative mind behind this, and he'll bring to our staff committee the idea of what the topic is and what it might look like. We then do the research. For the railroad exhibit, we did the text first and then went out and tried to find the images which would match it on the panels out in the gallery. We did it a little differently with this exhibit. We went and found the images that we have. And around you see some of Klaus Grutzka's work. He, being a sailor and an artist, had many that we could display. But in the exhibit itself, we have steel, iron and steel that was made in Lukens.
Now you're saying these are for sale also?
Actually, nothing is for sale at this point.
At this point.
We do take donations to name them,
Okay.
though. So the exhibit itself and the content will now be explained to you by our Educational Services Manager, Leanne Zolovich. Thank you, Leanne.
Hi, good evening, everybody. So the driving force behind the shipbuilding exhibit is the relationship between both ships and shipbuilding and iron and steel, which have both had a strong and influential relationship upon each other pretty much since both industries were founded in the history of time. And that relationship has led to not only critical changes in both technology and transportation, but also influential changes with fishing and travel, undersea discoveries, and of course war as well. And in the U.S., the relationship between both iron and steel in the shipbuilding industries goes back to 1825 with the building of the Codorus, which was the first iron-hulled ship built in America. And it did include plates that were made by Brandywine Iron Works and Nail Factory, which was the predecessor of Lucan Steel right here in Coatesville. And from that moment on, steel made in Coatesville was put into various other types of ships, from the early steamships to passenger liners to military and cargo ships and submersibles, submarines, and discovery things as well. And you can see examples of all of these types of ships in the exhibit out in the hallway and in the room here as well. And besides the Codorus, I'd like to mention two other ships that were made with Coatesville steel that were influential upon the history of shipbuilding and the history of the U.S. as well. And the first is the Nautilus, the USS Nautilus, which launched in 1954 and was the world's first nuclear-powered submarine. The Nautilus, it could stay underwater for long periods of time, which was unlike other submarines up until that point. They could go underwater, then they would have to come up, and they could go under again. The Nautilus was a little different in the fact that it could stay under for the entire time of travel. So the Nautilus was also the first to complete a submerged transit from the U.S. all the way up to the North Pole and back, I believe, completely underwater. And you can see some amazing photographs of the building of the Nautilus in the exhibit, as Lucan Steel had manufactured quite a bit of steel for it, and we have some great photographs out there to take a look at that as well. And the other ship I'd like to mention is the SS United States, which launched in 1951, and it was built by the Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company of Virginia, but Lucan Steel Company supplied steel for this particular ship, and she was the largest ocean liner constructed in the U.S., and she was also the fastest ocean liner to cross the Atlantic as well. And we actually have some artifacts, some menus and programs and different things on display from the SS United States, and they were loaned by Gene DiOrio, who did travel on the ship. And with that, I'd like to introduce Gene, who will speak a little bit about the SS United States and show us some slides from the SS United States as well as the Queen Elizabeth too, as well.
Well, thank you, Leanne, and good evening, everyone. As always, I'm happy to share pictures and talk with you, and of course, I'm a sort of fill-in because, as Jim explained, we had two speakers who both deferred and on short notice. Gene, can you help us? And I'm always happy to share these things. So the question was, what can you do with shipbuilding? And as it happens, I have a lot of slides that I took in 1968 in Scotland when the QE2 was being built. And happily, I still have those. My European slides have not yet gone along with. So I dug into that, and I also dug into drawers, and I found this tie with a canard that I bought on the QE2, which hadn't seen the light of day in a lot of time. So I promised to do that and talk about the trip to Scotland and talk about the QE2. And then, as she indicated, we have this special interest in the United States for which Lukens did provide. So they asked me if I would show slides of it from my visit in Philadelphia. So you're going to see two things, and we're going to start with the United States. I'm glad that they asked to do the U.S. because this provides a rather interesting historical juxtaposition. 1969, the United States lines decided to get out of passenger service and pulled the U.S. out of service. But also in 1969, Cunard put the QE2 into service in the same year. And I'll talk about this a bit more, but the question is, you know, here's one company dying and the other one putting in a whole new liner, and it's a rather interesting thing, and I'll talk a bit more. So I think we'll get on with the pictures. Sam, thank you. We ready? Where's the switch? Where's the switch? Leave the light on a minute.
Here.
Okay, I got it. Well, there's the United States as it looks today, rather forlorn, in his pier in Philadelphia. I think it was 3 years ago I was invited by some of the people who are endeavoring to save this ship to come see it. And it was interesting, but it was also very sad. This ship has been out of service much longer than it was in service. The United States Steamship Company decided to withdraw from passenger service and pulled this out. They had sent it to Newport News, to the shipyard for its annual overhaul. She was about to do a round-the-world cruise and go through the Panama Canal for the first time. The company canceled it, and it sat at Newport News at the shipyard for a while. It was moved to another freight pier somewhere in Norfolk area and sat there, I think, for about 20 years, unused. Then a gentleman by the name of Hadley, a businessman from the West Coast, bought the ship, and he was planning to use it for cruises and ships to Hawaii. But he never quite got it together, and he ran out of money. So to raise some cash, he had an auction. He sold all the fittings of the ship, stripped it, not just silverware and china, but furnishings, everything, and fittings. Even things like all the instruments that were on the bridge, all gone. So he has still hoped to do something with it, but he ran out of money. And I believe federal marshals seized the ship for non-payment of debts. It then went to a Turkish firm who were going to do something with it. They acquired the ship, towed it all the way to Turkey, at which point they did remove the asbestos. They also sold all the lifeboats off of it. But they didn't work out either, and then it was finally seized again because they didn't pay their debts, and it was brought back to the States and settled in Philadelphia, I think about 1996. It's been close to 20 years that she's been here. These pictures are especially impressive, even in its shabby shape. The bow, this very sharp bow, it's a beautiful piece of architecture, of naval architecture. And of course the paint is all gone. It was very sad to go through the ship, but you know, this was the promenade deck on the one side. In the heyday of the ship, this would be filled with lovely chairs and a lot of famous passengers like the Eisenhowers and movie stars and the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. And it's hard to remember what it was like when you see it as it is today. I had a set of deck plans that I took with me when I was touring, and oh, it was really, really poignant. But she's sitting there. The lifeboats are gone. They were sold when she was in Turkey. This ship is now 64 years old. Came out in 1952 and was withdrawn after only 17 years of service. And that's a long time, but they say the ship is still sound. The famous red stacks, which haven't had paint in 50 years, I guess. This is the builder's plate. I was amazed that it was still there. I figured when everything else was sold, they would have stripped that off and taken it. Before the present news broke, the other group was trying to save it. I said, if you scrap it, we would love to have this builder's plate for the museum here in Coatesville. But apparently it's still there. The United States lines in the years after the war wanted a big, fast ship to compete with Cunard's Great Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, and this is what they built. She was not as big, but she was much faster. I was on the clutter of the deck there in the front of it. But she was also built to be a naval auxiliary, a troop transport. That's what's left of what was the grand staircase. All the fittings, all the things are gone. You're just seeing the bare part of it. I think that was the stage. I did get into some parts of the engine room. I didn't climb down too deep, but there it is. Now, the news recently has been that after the Conservancy, which owns the ship and is trying to save it, said they were going to have to sell it for scrap, it brought a lot of publicity. And one of the world's largest cruise lines, the Crystal Cruise, have taken an option to buy it. Their thoughts are to restore the thing to passenger service. It'll be a smaller number of passengers. It'll be quite a luxury thing. I believe it's an option pending a successful examination of the ship for possible PCBs and other things. Now, the asbestos was removed when it was in Turkey, but the engine room is a concern, so I don't think they're going to actually buy it until they're sure there's no heavy environmental problems. The famous stacks, and there's the propeller. She had 4. They were taken off. 2, as far as I know, are still on the back deck where they were put. They were going to sell these for cash a few months ago because they were really running out of money, the Conservancy. But an angel came along and gave them a donation, so far as I know, the propellers are still there. I know one is at the New York State Maritime Academy at Throg's Neck. I've seen it there. But that gives you some idea with me in front of it how big they were. Looking towards the prow of the ship. And again, I had to get my picture taken there. I never stood there when it was crossing. They wouldn't let you up to there. But there it is. Now, it's going to be very interesting. Susan Gibbs, who was a granddaughter of the famous naval architect who designed this ship, has been heading this conservancy to save it. For a while, the Norwegian cruise lines took an option or bought it, but they figured they couldn't do anything with it. So the Jerry Lenfest, the Philadelphia philanthropist, gave this conservancy money to keep it going for a while. And they were close to running out of money, but now we're waiting to see what Crystal Cruise Lines actually does. She's still an impressive sight, rust, and deterioration and all. I'm going to take a quick break before we go to the next one. Take one moment to say, I've had a few people ask me, in fact one quite recently, did Lukens have anything to do with the great French liner, the Normandy? The answer is yes, but only very briefly and at the very end. When she was being scrapped by the Lipset Company in New York, a lot of cars of the scrap were sent here, something I didn't know until I was going through old annual reports and found a picture of a lot of small cars filled with scrap, which I understood came from the Normandy and which we melted here in our open hearth. Okay, 1968. I planned a tour to Scotland, and I wanted to go to Scotland first and then to England, and I decided to go over with the Canadian Pacific. They were at that time still operating steamers from Canada to Britain. And I crossed on the Empress of Canada. A wonderful ship, I loved it. And one of the reasons for going was that I found I could go right to Greenock. Now, a lot of years ago, Coatesville Historical Commission got established, and one of the people that I worked with was Stuart Houston. And Stuart was very enthusiastic about a sister city relationship with Greenock. Why? Well, first of all, the first owners of land of what is now Coatesville, the Flemings, came from that area, as did Roger Stewart and his family, a great deal of family things. And another reason was that we found that Greenock, here I am happily enjoying the cruise, we found that Greenock, like Coatesville, was primarily an industrial city, but located in a beautiful part of the countryside. Also, there was another reason. This is the Holy Island, which Stuart owned. When I crossed on the Empress of Canada, I got to know the captain. I had the good fortune to be invited to his table. So I told him I wanted to see the Holy Island, and he said, "Oh, we'll hit it at exactly this time and come up on the bridge." The Holy Island is like a satellite island. There's a large island called the Island of Arran in the lower Clyde River. It's about 20 miles long. And next to it, as a satellite, is this small island called Holy Island. It's about 2 miles or so long. And Stuart Houston owned it. He was very proud, as I'm sure, Skip, you remember, to own this piece of Scotland. So, thanks to the captain's courtesy, I was on the bridge as we rounded the curve, and there it was. So the first thing I saw in Scotland was Holy Island. Gets its name from a medieval saint. I think it was Saint Malay was the name of the saint. Well, we came up the Clyde, which is absolutely beautiful, much like coming up the Chesapeake, through the countryside. And this is important for shipping because when ships were built in Clydebank, they would do their trials here on the Clyde River, or the Clyde estuary. I was extremely fortunate to have a beautiful day that we arrived. The captain said usually it's fog and mist, but it was a glorious day with lovely clouds the day that I came. Now also in this area is, or was, a submarine base, Holy Loch. The United States Navy for a number of years had a submarine base here along the Clyde River. And I'm told that one of the submarines, the people in Greenock sort of adopted, and whenever it was in port, they entertained and hosted the crew. I've forgotten which one it was, but I did some checking before I went over and found out that that's the Holy Loch thing, that Lukens had made steel for that particular submarine. Happily on deck, the lady there was a fellow passenger. She and her husband and another couple, their husbands were both British Army officers. So we had a great time. And she was a niece of the Duke of Norfolk, I think, who was the Earl Marshal of England. It was a wonderful trip, really wonderful trip. Met a lot of wonderful people. And as we got closer to Greenock, we saw more river traffic. And there was my first view of Greenock as we pulled in. We did not go to a pier. We anchored out in the ride. It was a welcoming committee. And we anchored out in the roads and got off on a tender. Now, in planning this trip, I did a talk some time ago on this country touring, and I was staying in private homes with families. And my first host here was a retired British general, General Sir Gordon Macmillan. And we had a lot of letters, exchanges before I went over. What do you want to see? Well, being interested in ships, I said, well, while I'm in your area, would it be possible to go to Clydebank, to where the shipyard was, where the QE2 was? Well, much to my delight, I thought maybe we'd get a ride past and a view, but General Macmillan, when he retired from the Army, had gone into chairmanship of a dry dock company, and he knew everybody up and down the river, and he arranged a tour for me at Clydebank. We got there on a Friday, And the general had made tour arrangements Friday afternoon. He said, we have to go Friday. We can't go on the weekend. So he actually came out to the ship, met me. We got off the ship together on one of the tenders and went directly to, well, we dropped off my luggage at his house and went directly to Clydebank. So my first afternoon in Scotland was spent at Clydebank. But there's the ship and there's the shipyards. As I say, this was an industrial community, very much into ships. Greenock. As you can see, we anchored pretty far out. Now there's the tender going back to get more people. This area was very important during the Second World War. As the United States was preparing for the invasion of Normandy, and we had to take thousands of troops over there, it was too risky to bring them to the south of England because the submarines had infested the channel. So they brought them to Greenock. So a lot of American soldiers disembarked here. Now this was where I landed on this open space, and you can see more of the cranes of the shipyards here in Greenock. Well, the general drove me. We went to Clydebank, to John Brown's, which is one of the most famous shipyards in the world at that time. And went into the yard and went to the office, and I met Sir John Rannery, I think his name was, who was managing director. And to my delight, I got not just a look, but I got a rather heavy tour of the ship. And there she is. She was launched in '67. She was being fitted out, went into service in '69. I was thrilled, being interested in ships and particularly admiring the Cunard line. And it was in this very yard that the Queen Mary and the first Queen Elizabeth and other famous ships like the Aquitania and the Lusitania were all built. So this was quite a thrill for me. We wandered all over the ship. This, I understand, is all gone now. Extensive labor troubles and costs. The shipbuilding pretty much died on the Clydebank. That's the general, and the other gentleman with him was a representative. He went with us on the tour and escorted us through the ship. I've looked at later pictures of the other ships that were built here, and these buildings were all there at that time. That's the Clyde River, which becomes quite narrower as it gets up closer to Glasgow. It was an artist's drawing of what the QE2 was going to look like. And she was quite a departure from earlier ships. That's the first Queen Elizabeth, which was launched in 1938. And which unfortunately didn't have a grand passenger experience until after the war. It was a very interesting thing. She was being built, and then the war came on in Europe, and there was concern about what to do with it. They were anxious to get the yard cleared for military vessels, and Churchill says, no, finish it so that it can run. So she was finished, moved down the Clyde, stopped at the area around Clydebank, or rather Greenock, and a naval vessel went out with secret orders. The people on board didn't know where they were going, and the orders were take it to the United States. So rather than risk running it to anywhere else in England or Southampton, she made her maiden voyage from the Clyde River, Greenock area to the United States in total secrecy. Fortunately, she had no mechanical problems. She operated beautifully, and she made it very quickly. Only top management of Cunard knew what was happening, and then all of a sudden, here was this enormous gray-painted liner appearing off the Long Island coast. And that, of course, is the Queen Mary, the ship that was built in the 30s, was launched and went into service in 1936. Hands down, one of the most successful, popular liners ever built by anyone. I'm happy that I crossed on it twice, and I absolutely adored this ship. She has survived. She's a hotel out in Long Beach. Happily, she was not scrapped. Well, we walked around the decks. Here you see for the boat deck. Now later on I'm going to show you some pictures of this when she was finished, so take a good look at what it looked like then with the davits out. The stack was quite a bit of controversy. It was very modern, it was very different. And leads to why Kennard went with this. Some overview of the city. As the old queens were starting to get a few years and getting more expensive to operate, Kennard felt that they were going to have to build a new ship. And they actually started to plan one. It was called Queen Q3. And it would have been comparable in size to the first Queen Mary and the first Queen Elizabeth. Then they recognized that things were changing. By the 60s, jet aircraft were taking toll on transatlantic. Cruises were bigger. Kennard took a heavy look at the whole thing and decided to scrap the Q3 plans. And instead they went to a whole different thing with the QE2. She was much lighter weight. A lot of aluminum was used. Her tonnage was lighter. Her draft was not as deep. They wanted a ship that could be worked in cruises very easily. There were ports where the old queens could get into. They required a deeper draft. Also, she could maintain the same speed at less fuel consumption. And she was shorter. She was less than 1,000 feet because otherwise she couldn't cruise through the Panama Canal. Now I call your attention to here. You see that small stream. I think about a year ago we had a gentleman here give a lecture on shipbuilding on the Delaware. And he pointed out that one of the reasons that it died there was that the river wasn't wide enough, which I questioned. The Clyde is not that wide here. And when John Brown's had a big ship like the Queen Mary, to the left of the picture there's another ship under construction, the red area. They would put it in this one slipway that faced this small river in the back, which is called the Cart. The little Cart River was dredged as deep as they could get it. And when a big ship like the Mary or the Elizabeth was launched, it would go directly there, of course, with heavy drag chains to keep it from far. It took a lot of skill to launch that size ship in this small area. One moment while I change the reel. But Kennard's decision to build a totally different ship really saved them. Really saved them. Well, here you see the stack, and you see the Clyde. Now, then, I don't know if it's changed, but right opposite were a lot of open farm fields. That's General Macmillan.
Which one is he?
On the left. And the other gentleman was a representative of the company who went with us on this, escorted us through the ship. General Macmillan had quite a career. He was a military man, born in India, and had at one time commanded the army in Scotland and commanded Stirling Castle. He was knighted for his service in the war, and he was General Sir Gordon Macmillan. And his last thing before he retired, he was Governor General of Scotland, of Gibraltar. And while I was there, he showed me some delightful pictures of that ceremony when the Queen visited. Wonderful gentleman. We just got on very well. So there we are. One of my finest Scotland pictures with the General on the deck of the QE2. And incidentally, the 2 is not for the Queen, the monarch. That's why they did not use the Roman numerals. It was 2 to be the second Queen Elizabeth, the second ship Queen Elizabeth. There are wonderful photographs showing the Queen Mary being launched with thousands of people lining that bank on the other side, watching it. And of course, it was quite a project getting the Mary out. In fact, when she moved down the river, they didn't have her lifeboats on yet to keep the weight lighter. Unhappily, there was some extensive labor troubles. They got delayed with this thing being built. General Macmillan said, oh yes, they'll bring a horde of workers on at the last minute and they'll all be stumbling over one another. But there it was. Here's the general again. After the tour, we went back to the office, and the managing director, John Rayner, entertained us with tea and scone and so forth, and told some of the trials and tribulations of this sort of work. Innumerable number of suppliers have to bring everything together, and it's all a question of scheduling. And I remember he said, yeah, what do you do, in his thick Scottish accent, he said, what do you do when the mattresses are here but the birds have not arrived yet? That was his comment. But it was wonderful talking with him. And of course I had to climb down these ladders to get off the thing. I'm not terribly comfortable at heights, but you know, I had to do it, so the general and I walked down these ladders to get back to the pier. Tangles of wires and things. We were down in the bottom of the hull. I saw quite a lot of the ship. Then walked around the fitting out basin where she was being completed. This is a normal thing. A ship is launched, it's far from complete. And then the later stage in the fitting out basin, which can take another year or two. That's the bridge. And pay good attention, because later on I'm going to show you a picture of this in its finished state. I love the prow, very graceful prow on the ship. And it was that close, moored to the end of the pier, and I took that picture thinking, never again will I ever get that close to the prow of the ship. But I did later on, and I have a picture on that. This ship had quite a career. I think she operated for almost 40 years, during which time she went through remodelings, and at one point, after about 20 years of service, they completely re-engined it, got rid of the steam turbines and went into diesel electric. And they did a lot of redecorating. She made history in 1982 when Britain went to war with Argentina in the Falkland Island fight. And the British government commandeered the ship and packed it with troops to send them down there. They were very concerned about it. The Argentines would have loved to sunk it. But happily it didn't happen, and she got back safely and into service. And in 1982, as Chester County and Philadelphia were celebrating their tricentennial, Cunard brought the ship to Philadelphia, which was sort of interesting historically, because, you know, Samuel Cunard's ancestors lived in Philadelphia. In the 1680s, there was a ship that brought a group of German Quakers from the Palatinate and the Rhineland, one of whom was Jan Lukens, the ancestor of our Lucan, and another was a man named Kunrads. And they all settled here and anglicized their name, as Jan Lucan became Lukens, and Kunrad anglicized their name to Cunard. However, when the revolution came on, the Cunards were loyalists, and they left Philadelphia, went to Canada, settled in Nova Scotia. And Samuel Cunard was born there, and he was the one who, of course, established the Cunard line. So it was sort of interesting historically that she did come to Philadelphia in 1982. Jane Davidson, who was our county historic officer, was very interested in this. She was involved in the tricentennial. And one evening while it was in Philadelphia, they hosted a beautiful dinner party and formal affair on board the ship. Jane wanted to go, so I escorted her. Amusingly, they had hoped to bring it up to the Penn's Landing, but the mast was too high. It wouldn't clear the Walt Whitman Bridge, so it was docked. I believe it's called the Packer Marine Terminal. So it was kind of fun to pick our way through packing cases, everybody in dress, because it was a black tie affair, to get on the ship. But we did, and we had a wonderful evening there. And I call your attention, after the shows is over, I brought a photograph, which is propped on the window over there. That was given to all of us that night at the dinner, and I later had it framed. So there it is. There's wonderful excitement for me, my first day in Scotland, touring this great shipyard. Now, General Macmillan was chairman of a graving dock where ships were brought in for repairs. And on another day, he took me down to tour all this. Now here's a real Scotland day. It's foggy, it's misty. He pointed this out. If you look in the front, you'll see those lines. The first Queen Elizabeth was put into more cruising, and Cunard decided to put a swimming pool on the outside. So it was brought in here for it and other work, and because the ship was so long, they had to hack out part of this front of this area to accommodate the prow of the ship into it. This was all part of the graving dock that the general was chairman of the corporation there. And here he is. He was just wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed all the time with him. Extremely knowledgeable. And then he took me to Scott's. Scott's was one of the oldest shipbuilding companies in Europe, very much in business then, and I understand it's gone now too. But because I was interested in ships, the general took me around to all of these places. Now there's a real Scottish day for you. A lot of mist and so forth. But of course that keeps the ground green. Scott's was quite a yard, not as big as Brown's, and it was in Greenock itself. Excuse me. Well, I did my formal duty while I was there. General arranged me to call on the mayor, or provost as they call him, and we had a formal meeting there. And Riddle, I believe was his name, gracious gentleman. And doing my duty for Coatesville, I signed the guest register with the general and the provost there. Greenock. Still Coatesville city, although we haven't done much with it in recent years. Well, this is where I stayed. This was General Macmillan's home, an estate called Finlaston on the Clyde. And during my whole time there, it was there. Not quite Downton Abbey, but a substantial pile, as you can see. And that's General and his wife, Lady Macmillan. Wonderful hosts, and the first of the 4 families that I lived with during that tour in Scotland. And there we are one evening. They had something like a 1,000-acre estate overlooking the Clyde. Oh, and the Chester County touch, one night at dinner, Lady Macmillan, who had quite a business as a gardener, she had greenhouses, she had a flower business. And she said, now Eugene, you live in Pennsylvania. Have you ever heard of a place called Longwood Gardens? I said, well, yes, absolutely. Turned out she had a student whom she had trained who had won an intern scholarship at Longwood, and he was there. And they told me about him, so of course when I got back I looked him up. But it was beautiful there, marvelous, marvelous place. Okay, while I was there, I decided to go down to the island of Arran. I went down to Gourock, which is right next to Greenock, to get a boat and to go down there. The general took me to all these places. And I was intrigued to find the name of the boat that I rowed down there was called the Queen Mary II, with Roman stories, numerals. And of course I asked why, how did this ship get its name? And I learned this intriguing story that when Cunard was building the ship that became the Queen Mary, they had not picked a name. And the British government came to their aid. The building of the Queen Mary was delayed because of Depression years. Cunard got into a cash bind. And the British government loaned them money, but said we can't help everybody, and that you'll have to merge. So they merged with the White Star, and there she is, Queen Mary II. Well, that created a problem. What are we going to call the ship? Both companies had their policies, as many steamship companies did, of how they named their ships. White Star, always with an IC, Britannic, Oceanic, Titanic, Olympic, and Cunard with an IA, Mauretania, Aquitania, Berengaria, Scythia, so forth. So the story goes that Cunard decided to call the new ship Queen Victoria, which gave him an IA, but was a change from naming a ship from a geographical point of view. And incidentally, those Cunard names were all Roman Empire, ancient Roman Empire territories. Well, the story goes that to name a ship for a member of the royal family, you had to have the permission of said royal family. So the king is talking to the chairman of Cunard one day, how's your ship coming? And the story goes that he said, well, we would like to name the ship for one of England's most gracious queens. And before he could tell King George that he had in mind Queen Victoria, the king said, oh, wonderful, my wife will be delighted. I can't wait to tell her. His wife, of course, was Queen Mary, which left Cunard's chairman with his shirt hanging out, so Queen Mary it became. Now, there are historians that say that's true. There are others who say it's baloney, it never happened at all. Cunard never said yes or no. They never dignified it by denying it. But this was the Queen Mary too, and having learned that story, I was amused to find in the main salon of the ship there was a painting of Queen Mary with a brass plaque presented by the Cunard Steamship Company. Well, when I finished that trip in England, I came home on the first Queen Elizabeth, which, as you can see, is much larger and much grander than the QE2. These pictures were taken in Southampton. I had gone down on the train and I had some time and I'm meandering around the pier before I had to board the ship to leave. So there it is. Unhappily, this one didn't get saved. There were plans to do something like the Queen Mary, and it didn't pan out. She was sold to a Chinese shipping firm who was going to make it into a floating university, and while that was happening, it caught fire in Hong Kong harbor, which was usually regarded as an arson thing, and she was burned and lost. This is a ship that I particularly love because my first crossing was made aboard the Queen Elizabeth. She was very grand, not quite as loved as the Queen Mary, but she was certainly a wonderful ship. I had many happy memories. Now there's the QE2 as she was finished. Beautiful hull lines. And Skip, as you've said, she wasn't packed like an apartment house with 6 decks of stuff. But there she is. There was a lot of critical comment that when she was first come out, the smokestack was white. Why not the traditional Cunard orangey red color? Well, there were a lot of people who thought, well, we're breaking away from the past. But later on, it was redone in the Cunard. Now, in 1972, I went back to England aboard the QE2, and I showed you that picture as she looked in the shipyard, and there you can see how the bridge and everything was finished. Very graceful, really. It was alongside the pier in New York before I boarded it. And I got to stand. I told you, I showed you the previous picture. This was taken not quite as close as the one at the shipyard, but there's the bow of the ship in New York. Well, there I am getting ready for a party. We had a night sailing, and I had some friends who came to see me off, and Cunard graciously provided me with several bottles of champagne. We had a party, and one of my friends put a baggage tag on me. They were afraid I'd get lost. So there it is. We sailed at night, and coming down the river, I think you know what those buildings are. It was the World Trade Center, which was nearing completion, and I snapped a few pictures. In between sips of champagne, I took champagne with me and sipped it while we sailed down the river. A little off focus, I'm afraid, but it was night. Yes, well, none of us remotely dreaming of what would happen to those buildings. And there's that stack lit up. And this gives you an idea of what she looked like, all fresh and bright. I liked it better than I thought I would, having been thoroughly in love with the old queens. She was very different, but Cunard was correct. The days of the great transatlantic ships were over. It had to be used for cruising and so forth. And she rode fairly well. I was suffering with bursitis, and I was afraid I might have to cancel the trip. Lukens was concerned because it was my right arm, and I was a check signer here in the general accounting, but somehow I did manage to get the check signed. My doctor said, "Well, you're going by ship, you can go." So I boarded the ship in New York that night, and the next day we had a bit of rough water, and I slept the whole first day, which is exactly what I needed. Now you see there are the davits that hold which you saw in the shipyard. Yeah, I missed the whole first day, and missed the boat drill a whole bit. So the next day I was feeling fine with a good rest, and I arrived in the dining room a day late. And there I am, enjoying the trip. I love this picture. We were moving straight, you know, no curves, and you see the wake almost into infinity there. Some years ago, there was a book about shipping and transatlantic called The Only Way to Cross. And I read the book with interest, and I would have to agree, since I don't like to fly. But aside from a passion for ships, I love the sea, and the sea in all its moods and colors is great fun. So this is in Southampton. We got into Cherbourg first, crossed the channel, got into Southampton at night, and so I slept and stayed on board overnight, and then the next morning took the boat train up to London. But I liked the front design of the ship. I thought it was very graceful, and I particularly liked the prow. Now, I'm going to close this with a picture of a happy passenger who would quite agree that it is the only way to cross. So here I am. Well, that's this evening. I put this together. I hope I filled the hole somewhat, and appreciate you all coming this evening.
Well, thank you. Gene, where is the ship now?
The QE2? When Cunard retired it, they sold it to the Emirate in Dubai.
Oh, Dubai.
And I understand the plan was to turn it into something like a hotel, like the Queen Mary is. And from what I heard, it hasn't happened. It's still sitting there. So I don't know.
Yeah, Barbara and I were on that ship too. It was on a cruise.
Yeah, on a cruise. Yeah. Well, Cunard's management made the smart thing. I didn't turn that off.
I'll get it.
Could you? They did the smart thing, because had they built another grand ship, it probably would have just not done. Between labor troubles, the high cost of fuel, and mostly jet aircraft, the whole business of transatlantic just died. The French line built a huge ship called the France about the time we had the United States. And she was mammoth. I think she was comparable in size to the Normandy. But eventually, well, they had labor troubles, and the French government got tired of subsidizing, and it's gone. Same way with Italy. Italy had a lot of ships, but again, they were all heavily subsidized, the Italian government. And they pulled the plug, and that's that.
You know, you talked about the rough seas. Barbara and I were on that. And the second day out, we're down, I guess, off the Florida coast, and we had some 30 to 40 foot waves. And I went out on the front end, the bow, and I could see the ship, and she actually went down under the water and came up, and the water all came back.
And you were on the bow?
We were on the bow. I mean, up the top.
Up the top, yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
But it was really something to see. And one of the freight booms broke away from its lashing.
Oh, yeah.
But it was really quite, Ivan Morris was with us, and I guess the gals were still inside. But we went outside, and it was amazing to see the pitch and the yaw as this big ship would go down to 30, the captain said there were 35 to 40 foot waves.
Yeah, the ships are huge, but God's ocean is somehow quite larger. I experienced that. My first trip to Europe was made on the Queen Elizabeth, the Oak. And I had a magnificent crossing. The weather was beautiful the whole way. I had no sign of sickness, nothing, whatever. A month or so later, when I came home on the Queen Mary, it was a whole different. We sailed from Southampton, got to Cherbourg. First day out looked good. Then I remember late afternoon, I was walking on deck and I saw these huge black clouds in the distance. And so I went in and we had tea and so forth and got ready for dinner. And I was dressing for dinner. And we hit this huge storm. And I found out what seasickness was like. And I was trying to dress and I just couldn't do it. Meanwhile, there's a knock at the door and it's the steward with a cable from my parents. Love, Mother and Dad, have a great trip, enjoy. And here I am, back and forth, you know, attending to being seasick. So, no go. So I went to bed. And once you lie down, you had it with seasickness. Then about midnight, I remember there was a knock at the door, and it was the night steward who came in. Beg pardon, sir, beg pardon. He said, I've come to secure the ports. I said, what? Well, the old ships had these wonderful portholes with brass frames. Now, Queen QE2, you couldn't open the window, but the old ones you could. And I loved being able to open the windows. I enjoyed the sea. So they had these little knobs that closed the window. So he had this gadget, he put over the knobs, gave it a second jerk, and it tight. And I was way up under the main deck. I said, do you think the water can come? Oh, well, never know, sir, never know. Got to close it, captain's orders. So I fell asleep. Well, the next morning I got up. I couldn't eat. My stomach was very bad. So the steward, who was just marvelous, brought in tea or something. He says, go up on deck, get some air. So I did. And had biscuits and broth at 11 and all that. But I had no appetite. The seasickness had really gotten to me. I picked at some cold chicken. Came back to my room, and the steward said, in a very gracious way, since I obviously was not the best sailor, he said, we've just gotten word from the bridge we're going to run into a second storm, worse than the one last night. So you ought to get the shot, the injection. They have the shot. I said, yeah, fine. So he rings for the nurse, the sister, as the British call them. So she comes, and I rolled up my sleeve. She said, no, sir, in your bottom. So I got the shot. And she said, now, don't get too far, because it'll make you very sleepy. Well, meantime, we had hit the storm. I mean, the ship, I thought we were coming apart, you know. But I wanted to see it. So, of course, the old Queens had these enclosed promenade decks, which the QE2 did not. So slowly I made my way up, holding on to the, you know, like this. Got to the front of the ship where under the observatory. Stood there, mesmerized, looking out the windows at the sea and watching the Queen Mary's bow go under and the sea coming back. I watched it, I mean, I will never to the last day of my life forget seeing that. The sailors came along with the crank. They had a device. They rolled down steel plates behind the glass windows. They said, the sea is heavy enough it could break this. You're going to have to leave, sir. So I made my way back slowly to my cabin. We were creaking. I thought the ship would come apart at any time. And I'm looking out. I thought, well, no point in worrying. They're never going to launch a boat. So I lay down and I just went to sleep. Hours later, I woke up. Everything was quiet. I thought, I have died. I've died. And I'm laying there. Well, the old joke is if you get seasick bad enough, you feel you're going to die. And then as it continues, you're afraid you won't die. So anyway, I woke up, and after a while, no, I'm not dead. And the sea was still pretty heavy. The shot worked. I didn't have the slightest bit of sickness, and I was ravishingly hungry. So I got dressed, put on the dinner suit, went down. The dining room was half empty. Half the people were sick, you know. They had dropped the tables, which they do, you know. And a wonderful dining room steward, he said, you're hungry? I said, yeah. He said, well, don't eat any fussy foods. He said, just, you know, I'll get you a steak or something like that. So I ate double time the rest of the way back to New York. And I had never any more seasickness. The shot really worked. But then we had, the next day, we had fog. We had this thick fog which gathered. And I was afraid that I was going to lose out on something. I had asked for a tour of the engine rooms. Kennard was very fussy about that. You just didn't do a tour. You had to write a letter to the chief engineer and so forth. And I knew they wouldn't do it if the sea was rough. But although it was foggy, the sea had calmed. So I got to tour the Queen Mary's engine rooms, which was fantastic. A special delight of that, the engineer took us out to the last compartment on the bottom. There was this trough-like construction which had the shaft for the propeller. And he said, now, the reason for the shaft, the trough, is because these things get very hot as they turn, and they had water to cool it. So the water is brought in from the outside, and he said, now, gentlemen, I've had 2 other guys with me on the tour. He said, you know, that watertight door is the first one to get shut if water comes in, if we have an emergency, and there's no way out of here. So I think, well, that's great. But it was fun. And then the next day, well, the fog got worse that night. And I remember the next night, late night after dinner, I went up on deck looking around, and almost nobody there. The decks were wet from the fog. And I'm standing there. All you could hear was the whoosh of the water, the smoke, you know, the stacks. And we were moving. I mean, we were really traveling. They were making up time, I'm sure. And I was never afraid at sea, but I have to admit, it was eerie. It was eerie. We were moving along at fast speed. You couldn't see from here to that door beyond the rail. The fog was really very, very thick. But thank God we didn't hit anything, and the next day wasn't bad. But the last night, before we got to New York, I was awakened in the middle of the night. We hit a hurricane that was coming up the coast. That trip was really memorable. That was the most dramatic one I had. And I remember being awakened. There was a large wardrobe in my cabin. And when you opened the door, the light went on. So we rolled this way, the door came open and the light came on. We rolled this way, the door slammed shut. I remember getting up. But I remember that I was literally unable to lie still in my bed that night. But we docked on time, next morning, right in New York. So 3 years later, 66, when I came back from England on the United States, we had somewhat of a rough crossing, not quite as bad as that. And I never got done kidding my friend who worked for the United States line. We were half a day late docking in New York. We were supposed to dock at 8, we didn't dock to 1. And I said, oh, here I am in the fastest ship in the world, and we're half a day. You missed the 8? We were in the harbor, we could have docked at 10. He said, oh, no, we have unions to deal with. You either dock at 8 or you dock at 1. If you dock in between, you pay for 2 turns. So we all were on board until that. So it was a lot of fun. I'm glad I made the crossings when they were still Grand Atlantic liners. And if there's any other questions?
Great lecture.
About how long would it take to make, you know, something like the SS United States? I'm thinking, you know, Liberty ships took weeks to make.
How long to do what?
How long did it take to make a cruise liner, you know, a passenger liner? Like,
Well, you know, the Queen Mary was slow getting built because Cunard ran into a cash bind during the Depression, but normally about 2 years for construction, and then another year or so from the launching to the fitting out. Everybody's so interested in the Titanic. Well, the Titanic's sister, the Olympic, was launched, I think, 2 years before. She was into service in 1911. The Titanic was launched in 1911, went into service in 1912. So it depends upon the shipyard and how many people you put into it. But I'd say about 3 years, for construction. Well, thank you all.
Are they not bringing the Queen Mary? Where is the Queen Mary right now?
Long Beach, California.
California. All right.
Yeah, Cunard pulled the Queen Mary, the first Queen Mary, they retired it in 1967 and put it up for sale. Huge amount of criticism. I mean, there was a lot of people that felt that the 2 queens should have been kept, you know, one in England, one in the United States. Cunard was selling it to the highest bidder, and happily Long Beach outbid the scrappers, or she might have been scrapped. So she went on her last great cruise around, and she had to go around South America to get to California, too big to get through the Panama Canal. So it's moored there, and I think it's permanently anchored.
Well, what are they bringing over here in May? There's some, I thought it was the Queen Mary.
Skip said something, it must be the new Queen Mary.
Maybe it's the new Queen Mary.
Cunard has built the new, of course, you know, it's not Cunard anymore.
No.
Just a name. Like Lucan's, it's been sold, I think, 3 times. Carnival Cruise, I think, now owns the Cunard line. Carnival Cruise.
The ship's last voyage, I don't know. There's
Oh, she's
some-
too new. She's.
Oh, well, okay. Maybe it's a maiden, would it be a maiden voyage? We have friends that are doing this. They're
Oh, she's been to
flying
New York before.
Hmm?
She's been to New York
over.
before.
I don't know. This ship, there was some reason, it was a big thing about flying
I don't know.
over there and then coming
Back. Huh.
back to New York.
I don't know.
I was thinking maybe.
Well, Cunard decided to build the Queen Mary 2, and ironically, she was not built at John Brown's, who built the first Queen Mary and the QE2 and the Elizabeth. That yard's out of business. So the contract went to the French, and it was built at the same yard that the Normandy was built in, which was ironic because in the 30s, the Normandy and the Queen Mary were the great, great, great rivals. But they had to go to France to get it built. So. But the Normandy was a great tragedy. You know, I mean, she came out in 35. I think most marine historians would agree she was one of the grandest ships ever built. Very luxurious and very modern. Haute moderne, she was Art Deco. Despite her size, her line, she looked like a, you know, a yacht. She had only 5 seasons. She came out in 1935. And yeah, 5 seasons. In late August of 1939, she was on her westbound almost to New York. And it was just at that time that Hitler invaded Poland in September. And 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. So the Second World War was underway. So the French decided to keep the ship in New York, where she sat, with some of her crew. And then when we got into the war after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the United States government took it over with the idea of making it into a troop ship and bungled it very, very badly. One of the worst things they did was they decommissioned the fire control. She had a very sophisticated fire control. They just left it sit. They brought a lot of people on board to do all kinds of jobs that were falling over each other. And somebody welding a torch to take down something or other hit the stack of highly inflammable Copac-packed life jackets or whatever, and the fire started. And the fire got out of control and swept the upper decks of the ship. So then the fire department was pouring umpteen tons of water into it, and she lost her balance, and she went over, and she went sideways, and that was the end of the Normandy. But they eventually got it up, and the war was still on, and anything that would float was valuable, and the Navy thought they could. Her hull was still sound. And the fire, I understand, didn't reach her engine room. It was solid, but of course, after several months in the mud of the Hudson, it was ruined. So it went over to somewhere in Brooklyn after it was righted, and it looked for a while like it might be restored, but then the war wound down and it was too much money, so she was sold for scrap. And the Lipset company that we had business here, Lipset Luria, bought it, and it was towed down to somewhere in Jersey, Bayonne, I think, where they scrapped it. And of course, that's how we got pieces of it here, because it was, they chopped it up, it didn't have furnaces, so what they got was brought here. And no, neither Scott nor I were here to get pieces of it for the museum. I'm sure if we had been around at the time, we'd have tried. But that was the end of the Great Grand Normandy. Well, thank you so much again.
Thank you, Jim.